Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Jack Zenger. I'm here with my colleague Joe Folkman. The title of our webinar is Do Extraordinary Leaders Double Profits? First of all, a quick word about our firm. We're a firm that is a strong believer in research. We're fortunate to have a database of some 50,000 leaders who have been assessed by about 750,000 at least of their colleagues. We are partners with some of the world's most prestigious companies. We think we have a fairly clear understanding of what makes exceptional leaders and know how to help organizations accelerate their development. One of the characteristics of our firm is that we put a strong emphasis on building strengths rather than only helping people to identify their weaknesses. We would particularly like to invite all of the people listening on this call today to our Extraordinary Leadership Summit and Coaching Symposium that's held in July of this year. It'll be held in Salt Lake City. Full admission gives you access to some award-winning workshops. Our keynote speaker this year will be Kevin Wilde, who is the Chief Learning Officer for General Mills. Joe and I will share some exciting new research. And you'll have the opportunity to exchange ideas with some of your peers from all over the globe. Early bird admission is only $895, which is a $500 saving from registering later. And if you do that by March 31st, you'll enjoy that dramatic cost saving to your firm. We hope you can come. So on with today's webinar. We're talking about extraordinary leaders and their relationship with profits. We know very well that profits are not the only objective of a firm. In some cases, it's not always the main objective. But profits are necessary to both survive and grow, and they certainly are a well-accepted measure of the success of any firm. The major point of this workshop and webinar today is that leaders can have a substantial impact on a variety of different factors. Let me begin by just showing you what we think is one of the dramatic examples of what we're talking about. This chart describes the outcome of analyzing a group of leaders who were involved in the mortgage lending business. These were managers of branches that had between 25 and 30 employees. These branches were scattered across North America. They operated very independently, although they were within the same general kind of global economy, but they had the same policies and procedures. We were able to kind of look at the 10% of the leaders who got the lowest 360-degree feedback scores and compare them with the group that got the highest 360-degree feedback scores, and also, of course, those that were the 80% that was in the middle. What you see here is this fairly startling and pretty dramatic kind of outcome, and that is the bottom 10% of those branch managers had losses to the parent corporation of about $1.2 million a year. If you compare them with the group in the middle, that group had profits of $2.4 million. And so as we think about this, the main theme of today's webinar, do better leaders produce profits, often double the profits? Well, in this case, the group in the middle is actually tripling the profits of that bottom 10%. And then as you look at the top 10% of the leaders, these branch managers, they were producing twice as much as the group in the middle, roughly. And, they were producing a very dramatic difference between low-performing, poor performers and your top 10% leaders. Whenever we can measure a business outcome, most of the time we see a very strong, clear relationship between that outcome and overall leadership effectiveness. Now, when I say business outcomes, I'm talking about a number of things. We think these are the things that are inclined to influence profits. Things like employee commitment, recruitment ability, levels of customer satisfaction, the overall image of the firm, the ability of the organization to retain good people, its ability to be innovative and creative, its ability to be effective at generating revenue, and things like workforce productivity. These are the factors that we believe all combine together to create overall profitability for the firm. And we can show how clearly leadership effectiveness impacts each one of these.
Well, Jack, let's give some examples of this. And the first study we want to show here is a study looking at leadership effectiveness and employee satisfaction. And this particular study is done with 30,000 leaders across the globe, so a huge data set. And on the vertical dimension, what we're measuring is engagement, the extent to which employees loved their job, enjoyed coming to work, weren't thinking about quitting, and felt like this company was going to be successful in the future. And then across the bottom, you see those bars, and each one of those bars represent a decile in terms of leadership effectiveness, the first to the 9th percentile to the 90th to 100th percentile. So the first to the 9th percentile is the worst leaders. And oftentimes, if I'm working with a group, I ask the question, have you ever worked for a really bad leader? Most people have. And I said, what was it like? And most people say, gee, it was terrible. I hated it. I didn't like it at all. One woman one day said, I cried every morning going to work. And the fellow next to her said, I cried every night coming home. You have a bad leader, you have a dissatisfied employees. Notice that employees who work for the worst leaders are at the 22nd percentile. But if you look at the end of the graph, the 90th through the 100th percentile, what you get is employees at the 80th percentile in terms of engagement. And in the middle, you get average leaders. Now, what we found over time is that it's like there's this big mystery to how do you get engagement with employees. But the number one factor affecting whether employees are engaged or disengaged is who's your boss. Because if I know who your boss is, I can pretty much predict your satisfaction. And all these other factors really have a small amount of influence, but that manager has a tremendous amount of influence. Well, as you know, engagement does affect other things. There's a wonderful study done in Sears. This is a 30-year-old study that found that if you could raise the satisfaction or engagement by 5 points, that drove up customer satisfaction by 1.3%, which drove up profitability by 0.5%. Drive up A, it drives up B, it drives up C. And so one of the things we know, and by the way, that study's been replicated hundreds of times, both in retail, but also in places like hotels. Marriott does that study. Starbucks has done that study, but hospitals have even done that study. They've looked at cure rates and found there's a correlation between engagement and cure rates in hospitals. So we know that leadership is a key driver of engagement. Another study we're looking at here is retention, and this is in a financial services company. And what we're seeing here is the worst leaders, the first to the 9th percentile. We're looking at about 80% of their employees who are thinking about quitting. Now, just because you think about quitting doesn't necessarily mean you'll quit. But it is a good indicator because we do find that about 50% of the people that think about quitting actually quit. And if you look at the end of the curve there, the 90th through the 100th percentile, you only have about 10% of the leaders, or 5% of the leaders that are thinking, or the employees that are thinking about quitting. And so again, that correlation. And one of the things that we find is that every organization I know of is in a war for talent. They need the best employees. And what they find is when people quit, it's not the bad ones that quit. It's the good ones, right? Another study that we've done is looking at sales. And as we've looked at the impact of leadership effectiveness on sales, we measured again, poor leaders, bottom 10%, great leaders, top 10%. And then this is sales, and these are sales in millions of dollars. And you can see the difference between the worst leaders, less than 100 million, and the best leaders, over 600 million. Now, what's fascinating about this study to me is I was with a group of salespeople and someone raised their hand and said, who would you give the best region to? And I said, I don't know, maybe the best leader. And he says, well, is this about your ability to generate sales, your ability to get the best region? And then somebody else raised their hand and said, I'd put the best region, leader in the worst region. So it's hard to tell. I think there's a little bit of both there, but you can see that's an interesting relationship there in terms of sales. And then we just did another study in Mexico with a retail store. And what we found there is the change in sales over the year. This is store-to-store sales over a year period, and the percentage increase as we compared one store to that same store a year ago. And the worst leaders have almost no increase, and the best leaders have 7.4%.
All in the same economy.
Yeah.
All in the same.
And not a good economy, by the way. And this study was just done last year. Mexico was struggling in a bad economy. And so you can see that impact there. Another study we looked at that I thought was really fascinating was people's satisfaction with pay. You know what bad pay is? Average pay, bad boss. But when you look at that, you can see that if you had a bad boss and you looked at your pay, you thought, boy, they can't pay me enough. But as you looked at the effect of a good boss, people with a really good boss felt a lot better about their pay. And then this final study here gets at something I think is the crown jewel of all our studies, and that's discretionary effort. Every day when people come to work, they make a decision. Am I going to do the minimal possible to keep my job? Am I going to do more than that? Or am I going to give you 150%? What this graph shows you is the percentage of people that are willing to give you 150%. They're willing to go above and beyond. And you can see there that, again, the worst leaders get about 13%, but the best leaders get over 50%. And then when we did that same study in a large pharma company, we found those percentages change. But you can see here that in that pharma company, the best leaders, top 10%, over 80 or about 80% of their employees were willing to give 120%. That makes a huge difference because that affects productivity. It affects the number of employees you have to hire. It affects the whole morale of the unit. It affects their ability to generate success. That is an impressive bunch of studies. So, Jack, what's your conclusion out of that?
Well, let me bring up a picture here of our great friend Peter Drucker, the late Peter Drucker, one of the most profound kind of management thinkers of all time. On one occasion made this interesting comment that a 10% increase in productivity would double the profits for most organizations. And I've thought about that a lot in the intervening years. You think about a 10% increase doubling the profits. Now, he was assuming a firm that had about 50% of its costs being in the human or people arena. But you can kind of create a little grid, and this was actually published by a man named Simpson a number of years ago, that plots out, if you look at various levels of productivity improvement, 5, 10, 20, 40%, and if the people costs of the firm are 50% or 40% or 30%, you can see that where there is a 50% cost of people and 10% productivity increase, that it is indeed 100% growth or 100% improvement, therefore doubling profits. And you can obviously fill in all the squares and looking at different levels of people costs. And so you can kind of plot your own organization in terms of what portion of your overall cost structure is people. But what it says is very strongly that this thing you were talking about, Joe, and that is discretionary effort. If people can put forth 10% more effort, it makes a huge impact on the profitability of the firm.
Sure does.
Now, is a 10% gain in productivity even reasonable? Let me show you kind of 3 bodies of research that may be useful to kind of explore. First of all, our own research shows that about 20% of the people that we survey show high satisfaction and commitment. And by that, they score at the very top of the scale when they're asked about their level of engagement or commitment. There's about 37% who have moderate levels of satisfaction and commitment, and there's about 43% with fairly low levels of satisfaction and commitment in their work. Now, that means then that almost a half of the people with this low level of commitment and satisfaction have a long way to go. And based on the previous studies that you've seen, you know that that's very much driven by the nature of the boss that they work for. A number of years ago, there was a group of scientists named Hunter, Schmidt, and Judesh, and they collected a number of studies that had been conducted on this topic of productivity. What they were looking at was the wide differences between people who were doing the same job and the differences between the highest performer and those in the middle and those at the bottom. They analyzed all this data based on what they could tell as the complexity of the job that they were doing. And what they found was something that's not going to be a surprise to anybody listening on this call. But that is, for a medium complexity job, if you look at the top person in a distribution doing basically the same kind of work, that person is 85% more productive than the person who is right dead square in the middle or at the 50th percentile. If you move to a more complex job, an engineer or a systems programmer or an analyst or a lawyer, or certainly doctors, high complexity jobs, the person at the top 1% was 127% more productive than the person at the middle. So imagine the spread between the top person and the one down at the bottom or the one down in the lower quartile. The enormous differences. And what this then says, I think, again to us is a 10% improvement in productivity reasonable? Yeah, we think so. Gallup organization has done some research on this question of engagement, and many people on this call will be familiar with the fact that Gallup argues that 29% of employees are engaged, 55% are not engaged, and 16% are actively disengaged. These are people who are kind of engaging in sabotage. They really are thwarting the work of the organization. So you see this large group of employees who are either not engaged or actively disengaged, clearly again saying, there really is an opportunity for a 10% improvement in productivity. Now the question is, can we develop leaders that are capable of having this effect on people? And we believe the answer is clearly yes. We see good examples of organizations who are doing it. We've got hard data that shows over time leaders getting better. We see that when they are using an effective leadership development model, one that measures things that truly make a difference in the performance of the organization, that it works. And kind of patterning ourselves after the system in medicine called evidence-based medicine, if you use only those things that you know are truly work and do produce good results, you can focus your efforts and gain the greatest leverage possible. And if you focus on people building strengths, we know, again from our research, that those organizations that seem to focus on weaknesses don't get the same kind of results as those who have come to the realization that the strength of leaders is because they really are good at a handful of things. So we go back to this example that we showed you earlier. If you look at the impact of leaders on the profitability of a firm, you can see why collectively, as we talk about these forces that are unleashed on various business outcomes, you can see why the bottom 10% is so dramatically different than the ones at the top 10%.
And I guess at this point, people might be saying, okay, you've convinced me. Leadership makes a difference. And I can measure it. So what can we do to really improve the effectiveness of our leaders? And we're going to talk about 7 things that we think make a huge difference in terms of that development process. The first one is greater self-awareness. The second one is around actionable development plans. A lot of times people are given feedback, but there's no plan that goes along with it, and so nothing changes. We want to talk about something called nonlinear development. Providing skills and knowledge acquisition, use current position as leadership classroom, and we find that people using their position as a development opportunity really makes a difference. Involving the immediate manager is critical, and then implementation and sustaining activities. So let's first talk about self-awareness. As we think about leaders, and if you go to any leader and you say, tell me how you are as a leader. You a good leader? You a bad leader? You okay leader? Most are going to say, I'm okay. And some will say, I'm pretty good. And some say, I'm pathetic. But when we've looked at a person's ability to predict their leadership effectiveness versus any other rater, what we find is that people are only about half as accurate at predicting their strengths and weaknesses as the managers, the peers, the direct reports, or others. Others are twice as accurate as that person is at predicting how effective that leader is, which leads us to the obvious conclusion that oftentimes one of the biggest problems with leaders is they don't know what they're good at, and they don't know what they're bad at. They kind of have some guesses, but then sometimes even the feedback they do get is not so good. So what we'd like to do is get you to think about a few questions and just answer them for yourselves, which really get to the issue of self-awareness. The first question is, do you have a profound strength? We define a profound strength as a competency at the 90th percentile, so in the top 10%. So do you have a profound strength? Second question, how do you compare in terms of your leadership effectiveness to the best leaders across the globe? As you think about yourself, would you be one of the best leaders? Would you be in that bundle? And how would you compare? Where would you be high and where would you be low? The third question, do you have a fatal flaw? There's a difference between a weakness and a fatal flaw. We think a fatal flaw really diminishes your effectiveness and can seriously hurt you as a leader. This would be a nice thing to know. And I'd say that oftentimes this is a bit of a surprise to people that they do have a fatal flaw. Next question, which of your rater groups, managers, peers, direct reports, or others, perceive you in the most positive or most negative light? Well, that's nice to know. And what we oftentimes find as we look at 360 data is people have a tendency to either manage their direct reports, but they don't manage their boss very well. And some people are good with peers and some people aren't. But great leaders are able to satisfy all those groups. Next question, which competencies are the most important for you to be good at to be successful? This is key. One of the things we found in our research is you don't have to be perfect to be an extraordinary leader, but the question is, well, what do I need to focus on? Which ones are most important? And then the last one, what's the level of engagement of my direct reports? How engaged are they? When I talk to them and I ask them how they're doing, they all go, great. I wonder if they have an anonymous survey, if they'll say the same thing.
You know, Joe, a few years ago, I'd been teaching at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and Stanford turned to their advisory council and they asked them, what one skill, what one quality do you think leaders in today's world need to have? And it was fascinating that when they got the responses back from their advisory council, the number one thing that they had agreed upon was leaders need greater self-awareness. They just don't know about their own strengths and their own weaknesses.
And you know, the other thing that's interesting about Jack, that, Jack, is I've asked a leader, have you had a 360? And he said, yeah, about 5 years ago I had one. And then I say, has anything changed in your life? Anything changed in the organization? Anything changed in the world in the last 5 years? And they go, yes, everything's changed. So that skills that you once had, that perception that you had 5 years ago, it's probably not the perception today.
The second thing we've learned is that leaders really benefit from having an actionable plan of development. Left to their own devices, what we've found is that at most 10% of leaders would ever take the initiative to develop for themselves a truly kind of actionable plan of development. The organization needs to often give them a little bit of encouragement. And so based on this feedback that they get and the greater self-awareness, that then enables them to put together for themselves a plan of development that they can really put into serious action. So, for example, one of the things that we've developed is this whole idea of nonlinear development, which I know you're going to talk about, Joe. In fact, why don't you go ahead and do that? Talk about the nonlinear development as an approach to helping leaders become more effective.
Well, and again, Jack, this whole idea of these developmental suggestions, one of our clients challenged us to help leaders really get clear and make clear action plans. And so we came up, I still remember the meeting where they were showing us a list of 40 development suggestions. And I remember what you said. You said, you know what would be better than 40? 3 good ones. And so an upgrade to our product that we released last year was with every one of our companion behaviors, we have specific developmental suggestions to help people improve. One of the things that's interesting about improvement is something we call nonlinear development. So let's say that you were a leader and you were interested in drive for results and you weren't very good at it and you wanted to improve. And so because you weren't very good, one of the things you could do to improve would be, well, work more hours and maybe set higher targets and, be a little bit more demanding in terms of what you're asking people to do. Now, if you were really bad and you did those 3 things, that would help, right? And we call that process linear. But what's interesting in our research is that we found, and we said this in our last book, The Exceptional Leader, How to Be Exceptional, this idea that you run out of gas. So let's say that you weren't bad at drives for results, that this was actually a strength. You were pretty good at it, but you wanted to be great. You wanted to go from good to great. And if you use the same logic you use from going from bad to good, instead of working more hours, you might sleep at the office, get a cot, or you might set impossible goals and targets, or you can be overly demanding and angry. I mean, if being more demanding helps, then just be obnoxiously. And if you say to people, would that be it? Would that drive a person from good to great? And most people say no. In fact, all of us say no. I mean, in a lot of respects, this might get a person fired. Things worse, yeah, or at least ruin his life and make him really a tyrant. So what does work? What we did is we looked at every one of our competencies, and we found that when people were really good at one behavior, there were other behaviors that influenced that behavior, that supported it, that helped that competency, and we call these sort of enabling behaviors or competency companions. So, for example, on drives for results, one of the companion behaviors for really improving your ability to drive for results is planning an organization. That just makes a ton of sense, doesn't it? And in fact, it's the number one companion behavior. And again, if you sit down and make a good plan and it's just sort of pushing people, but they don't know where they're going, that doesn't help. Another one is being trusted. And one of the things that you can see that those second level linear ideas, they would drive trust out of an organization. People do and will work very hard for people they trust. A third one is having a clear vision. People can accomplish a lot more when they know where they're going and why they're going there. And that's an important thing. And a fourth one is to act quickly. Speed is strongly correlated with getting results. Well, there's more of those. But what we find is that we've developed this capacity to help people go from good to great. And we think that other 360s are pretty good at helping people go from bad to good. But really, there's a huge difference between good leadership and great leadership.
The next thing our research led us to was the importance of developing skills. So as we've done more and more work with organizations, helping their leaders to identify the things they were good at, the things they were not so good at, we've learned that there are some other, important skills that need to be acquired. One of those is coaching. We think that the practice of coaching embodies and sets into operation many of the best behaviors of the world's leaders at this time. And so by teaching people the skill of how to conduct a good coaching conversation, you can really help them become a great deal more effective. A second skill that we think is really important is feedback. Probably one of the most difficult things that most of us do in organizations is to give straight, candid, honest feedback to the people with whom we work. And so we have developed a skill building program that teaches a manager how to conduct that conversation, how to prepare for it, how to handle the most difficult situations that they're likely to encounter. We have one more skill building program. It's kind of a skill building and an awareness program that teaches leaders how to be more inspiring and to kind of bring about greater levels of motivation in the people with whom they work. The fifth thing that we've learned is that managers often kind of say, well, I'm busy. I don't have time for putting my personal plan of development into operation. And we would make a strong kind of counter argument. We think that whatever position a manager currently occupies, that position can be a wonderful leadership development classroom. If the manager can see that there are opportunities to practice building relationships, being a better communicator, being a better planner, providing greater vision, being a good problem solver, all those leadership behaviors that are so crucial to one's effectiveness, they can be practiced on the job, and the job is a great place to put those into practice.
Well, it really motivates you to want to do a good job because you're going to be evaluated on it, and it's part of your work. And so it doesn't feel like it's hard work or a classroom that's unrelated. It feels like it's part of your job.
And again, the key to making this current position into a true learning experience is having clear, accurate feedback on a regular basis from your colleagues.
Another thing that really helps is this involvement from your immediate manager. I just did interviews with 10 people who'd been through a self-development process, and so there really wasn't any classroom instruction, and people were on their own. And I was struck in there at the level that people rated the experience at. And I thought, boy, we have created this great product. But one of the things I found that was so critical is every one of the 10 people had their manager involved. And their manager knew what was going on. And their manager was checking in with them. Imagine the difference. A person A goes to a training program. Boss never interacts with him. Boss never checks with him when he comes back, and really seems sort of just
ambivalent about
ambivalent about the whole thing, about whether you go or not. It's sort of like, oh, it's your deal. Versus, okay, you sign up for a training program and your manager comes in and says, I heard you signed up for this program. I'm excited you're going, and I'm going to give you some feedback, but others will too. Let's talk about who you're going to ask for feedback from. And I want you to pay special attention to these kinds of things in the program. So you go to the program. The day you return, your manager comes in. How'd it go? Yeah, I know you're still working through your data, but I'd really like to talk to you. Can I set up an appointment in a week and a half to follow up with you? In a week and a half, there's a follow-up conversation that occurs, and your manager helps you. I mean, the difference is so big. And we've measured this over and over again, and we know that if managers are involved, boy, the development just gets better.
The final element that we would submit is that it's not just what happens during some kind of a development experience, but it's really what happens afterward. And the key to having true success comes from the sustainment activities that take place afterwards. And these sustainability activities can be anything from a repeat session, kind of a mini session of what was originally taught, or it could be a lunch where people get together and they have a, kind of a brown bag working lunch where they talk about what they're doing to implement what they learned. It can come in the form of a series of emails that come to them with suggestions, with ideas, with articles to read. But it's that whole collection of follow-on and follow-up activities that we know from our research makes a huge difference in the progress of the leader.
So the question is, well, does this stuff really work? Can leaders really improve? And I find a lot of pessimists out there. They're saying things like, well, you can't teach old dogs new tricks. Well, guess what? People aren't dogs. Here's what we found. And what's interesting is even in the leaders who have what we call fatal flaws, when we looked at our data and looked at people with fatal flaws, in our pretest data, they were at the 23rd percentile. And those who worked on improvement went from the 23rd percentile to the 56th percentile. They made a 33 percentile jump in terms of their effectiveness. And that led to a 23% jump in employee engagement by their direct reports. You improve A, you improve B. And then when we looked at leaders who didn't have fatal flaws, we found that some continued to work on their weaknesses, and they made a 19 percentile point jump. But those that built strengths actually made a 26 percentile point jump. And this is based on 412 leaders. It's a big study. But what we see is over and over again, we know that people can improve. We know that when we give people actionable feedback, give them a development process, nonlinear development, have them focus on their strengths, that improvement can occur. We recently, over the last year, did a little webinar and a podcast where we talked about Symantec and how they'd taken a group of leaders through this training and then took them back through the training. They actually saw significant improvement on every one of their competencies.
That's pretty impressive. Statistically significant improvement in every one of those competencies. Well, here are some parting thoughts then on this broad topic of the effective leadership on profitability. We strongly contend that leadership has a quantifiable, measurable impact on profits. It can be observed on a number of dimensions. Good leaders create more economic value than poor leaders. And great leaders create far more value than the merely good ones. You saw that difference between the top 10% and that group that was good, that were in the middle. We believe that we can help you develop more extraordinary leaders. And Joe, you're going to welcome them to welcome the opportunity to have us work with you.
We would love to work with you. One of the things we're going to do is we'd love to assess your current level of leadership effectiveness. And I'd say that this is surprising to a lot of organizations. Most organizations believe they have a set of really, really good leaders. That's not always true. I was working with a group recently, and I met with the director of the group, and I said, "So, how are your leaders?" And he says, "Oh, they're clearly in the top quartile." And I said, "Well, not quite. They're actually at the 39th percentile." How's engagement? Oh, clearly above average. Well, not quite. It's actually in the bottom quartile. He was oblivious to this, and his rating on these leaders was quite good, but others weren't. And so getting an accurate measure, and that's our message from this, is we can accurately measure these things and let you know where you are. The second thing we'll do is provide a process for every leader to understand their feedback, their leadership effectiveness, and create an actionable plan for growth. And then, based on that data, we can provide for you very similar graphs to what you've seen us show today on the relationship to engagement, to percentage of highly committed employee, percentage of people who are thinking about quitting, or even studies on profitability and sales and other things like that. So we'd love to work with you on doing that. We know we can make a difference in organizations, and we know what we do has a significant impact. By the way, your leaders need the evidence to say leadership does make a difference. And when you show them that, they really pay attention. So in closing, we'd like to remind you again about our Leadership Summit and the Coaching Symposium in Salt Lake City, July 20th through 24th. Again, this is one of our favorite events of the year. It's a great experience, and people that come really have a very positive experience here. Register early, save your company and yourself $500. There's a tremendous advantage to that. And so you'll be able to attend a series of workshops, meet with colleagues. The networking, I think, is important, and I might even cook you a steak, maybe, or some zucchini. So that's oftentimes part of it. Thanks, Jack.
And once again, thanks very much for joining with us today in this webinar.